Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our presentation, Beyond Mad Men, the Necessity of Multidimensional Marketing, presented by Professor Cait Lamberton from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania in collaboration with Ivy-Exec. This is the first Wharton webinar in the series of 3, and we will be notifying you of the upcoming classes led by Wharton faculty members in the weeks to come. My name is Mariana. I'm on the higher education team here at Ivy-Exec, and I'll be helping to moderate today's session. Before we begin, I have a few brief housekeeping items for our audience. First, all attendees are currently in listen-only mode. However, we do encourage you to engage in the session by asking questions to our presenter, which you can do using the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. We do encourage questions during the presentation. We'll also have a formal Q&A session during the last 15 minutes of the webinar. Additionally, we are recording today's session, so you can look forward to receiving a copy of the recording via email in the coming days. And now I will pass it on to Peggy Bishop-Lane, Vice Dean of the Wharton MBA Program for Executives, who oversees both the Philadelphia and San Francisco programs. Before joining the MBA Program for Executives at Wharton, she directed the academic experience for the full-time MBA program, and Professor Lane teaches introductory accounting to first-year executive MBA students and is here today to introduce our speaker and say a few words about the Wharton Executive MBA Program.
Thank you, Mirana. And everyone, welcome to today's webinar, sponsored by the Wharton MBA Program for Executives. As Mirana said, I'm Dr. Peggy Bishop-Lane, Vice Dean of the Wharton MBA Program for Executives and a Professor of Accounting. The Wharton MBA Program for Executives is one of 2 ways that you can earn the Wharton MBA degree. Our program is suited to mid-level and executive-level professionals in a variety of fields, industries, and functions, including media, finance, government, engineering, entrepreneurship, and data analytics. The program is in an every other weekend format and is offered both in Philadelphia and San Francisco. And if a full MBA degree is not for you, Wharton also offers an extensive series of executive education programs through our non-degree exec ed division. Today, we are pleased to have Professor Cait Lamberton, the Alberto Duran Presidential Distinguished Professor of Marketing, to talk about her most recent line of research around consumption. We hope that you will find this not only interesting and useful, but that it will also give you an idea of how faculty bring their research into the classroom. We're fortunate to have Professor Lamberton join Wharton in 2019 and teach in the Executive MBA program this year. She recently finished teaching an elective on consumer behavior to second-year executive MBAs. And last year, she taught a marketing strategy elective to our second-year full-time MBAs. And I believe right now is teaching introductory marketing to undergraduates. So she teaches all of our constituents. She's an award-winning teacher and scholar. As an example, she was most recently recognized by the American Marketing Association with an award for responsible research in marketing, and has been recognized by her students as a top 40 under 40 business school professor by Poets and Quants. Dr. Lamberton also acts as a consultant, primarily in the finance and pharmaceutical domains, and has participated in the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's Commission on Reducing Food Waste in the United States. Here today to discuss Beyond Mad Men, the necessity of multidimensional marketing, is Professor Cait Lamberton. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lane. It's nice to be here. So excited. I wish I could see you all in person, but we're all learning that virtual attendance is just as great. So thanks so much for your attention. And I'm going to ask you to jump in by participating right away here. All right. So if you guys haven't used Poll Everywhere before, I encourage you to give it a try. You can either do this with your cell phone by texting, or you can respond at this link above. If you would take a minute and just give me an idea of what comes to mind when you think of marketing. I'm interested to hear where you are on this question. So jump in if you can. It should be ready to work, to take your responses. Yep, brands. Storytelling is certainly something that's taken off in the last few years. Persuasion, people, narratives. So what's interesting that you see as these words come in is that what we have here is a mix of things, right? We have modalities like digital, we have tactics, right? Like advertising, we have focus like people, we have sort of approaches like storytelling and narrative, we have impact on the bottom line or the top line, depending on how you build this into your business, like money, right? So what you begin to see here is that marketing in itself, no matter how you think of it, has a lot of different pieces. Now, each of us often will focus on only one of these. What I want to challenge you to do today is to incorporate 5 somewhat new ideas into this so that this multi-dimensional thing called marketing can start to have a structure, all right? And I want to take us back for a minute to the world of Mad Men. When I ask my undergrads what they think marketing is, I get a lot of ideas that probably are drawn directly from a few exposures to some Mad Men clips. If you are a Mad Men fan, or you were at any point, what you probably remember is a lot of creative people in a room talking about a persona, right? And our hero, Don Draper, was very good at creating these really persuasive pitches, some of which had narrative elements, of course, none of which had digital elements. They were also really good at, smoking cigarettes and drinking scotch, okay? But this is not the world where either our undergrads or our MBAs are gonna work. We can't simply rely on our own creativity and charm to make marketing work. And so what we have now are a bunch of people that are feeding us other ideas. All right, and many of you, I'm sure, have been exposed to some of these folks. I also want to challenge these, all right? These people are brilliant people, but if you look at these statements that are waved around continually and reflect on your own experience, you might find yourself scratching your head. For example, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. I would actually challenge you to think about the last product you bought that you bought because of why the company built it. Okay, we're going to talk about this later, but a company that focuses too much on their own reasons can get very confused about what's going to work for the consumer. Selling is about a transference of emotion, particularly right now. People are pretty emotionally exhausted. If you think about marketing as an emotional gambit, you may far overplay that hand. There are cases where consumers, in fact, are rational. When they actually do just want to make analytical decisions, we can figure out where those are, and we can speak to them in a way that makes sense. And then you have things like what separates good content from great content is a willingness to push the envelope. I don't even know what that means. Maybe you do. This is not the kind of statement that actually helps us make go, no-go decisions, all right? So I want to ask us, we don't want to live in the world of Mad Men, but where do we want to live? Can we live in a place that has structure and rigor and analytic tools that get us closer to a management of that entire system that you guys laid out as being critical for marketing? And the way I want to go at this is by taking some ideas from a field called complexity science. I've just been doing work in this area in the last few years, and although, to be honest, some of the math is unbelievably sophisticated, it's the core ideas that come out of this that I find really compelling. If you find this interesting, I would check out, there's a book by a woman named Melanie Mitchell called Complexity that lays out these ideas in a way that make it very clear, if you have a business mindset, how they apply to what we do, okay? And what does this actually mean? To say that the market, and therefore marketing, is a complex system doesn't just mean it's complicated. This builds on about the last 150 years of work in describing human behavior. Before 1900, we lived in a world where we really could only look at a few variables at once. We were computationally limited. And so you might say something like, when we raise price, we see sales decrease. Pretty predictable relationship. Branding goes back for at least 1,000 years, if not longer, when people were putting inscriptions on the bottom of pottery to indicate who made it. And you could say the presence of an inscription creates more sales than the absence of an inscription, all right? And those were the kinds of relationships that we really looked at. As our computational power got better, we began to say, we don't only need to look at 2 variables, right? We need to look at more than that, because we have huge groups of people doing things, And what we want to do is get a handle on the extent to which we can make this predictable. As you guys know, being able to predict something in business is incredibly powerful. So we said, let's average. We can do that. And then we can compute probabilities of different behaviors. And this was a big step forward. But then as we moved into the actual computational age, we said, no, that's not even enough, right? Because the problem is that an average can hide as much information as it gives us. So for example, you might say we have 10 people that buy 0 cans of Diet Coke a month, and we have 10 people who buy 10. You average that out to 5, and then you start marketing to the people who buy 5, but nobody buys 5. In fact, that average doesn't tell you anything about what's actually happening in the market or who your consumers are. So what you need is a more sophisticated approach that allows you to recognize the actual distribution of the data. And this also means there's no average company. So you can't just look at what some other company is doing, apply it to yours, and assume it's going to work. On average, it doesn't exist. This is the kind of system that we're working in, all right? And what does this mean? Well, it means a few things. First thing is that just like with these ants, the whole is often more than the sum of its parts. Any one of these ants has a minuscule little tiny brain that can't build anything. It's when you put them together that they can build these incredibly strong structures that create bridges. The same thing happens in the marketplace. Okay, so we have to look at individuals as individuals, but we also have to try to figure out the phenomena that emerge out of a population. We also want to realize that markets and consumers evolve over time. I'm doing some new work on dignity where we're finding that consumer dignity is respected most. And part of that is that we recognize that the consumer does change over time, that growth is an inherent part of humanity, all right? Another thing that we realize if we have a complex system framework is that as the systems become more and more complex, it takes less and less for anything to disrupt them. And I think this is something that had we been talking about before 2020 could have saved us in a lot of ways. We focused a lot on integration, right? On having all these moving pieces that supported one another. The problem is you get one grain of sand in these enormous systems and the entire thing grinds to a halt, okay? And then finally, I want to talk about the fact that chaos is information. Some of you may be familiar with information theory, but that's where this idea comes from. If a small child only has 2 words that they can say over and over and over again, there's a lot of order. There's a lot of predictability, but they can't convey much information to you. As their vocabulary grows, it becomes more chaotic. You don't know what's coming next. For God's sake, you don't know what's coming next. But they're also able to convey far more to you. And if we approach the complexity of the marketing system this way, we are always going to be learning. All right, so I'm going to break this down I'm going to give you a couple examples first of how this is played out. So this is an example of an emergent phenomenon. Historically, Pedialyte, you might be familiar with, was a product that was really marketed to parents of small children. And Pedialyte had a lot of research on those individual parents. They also, of course, had the rich big data that everybody else has that would tell them that in some zip codes, there were virtually no parents. So it wouldn't make any sense to do marketing in those zip codes or to target those consumers. Then they started noticing that sales were going way up in these zip codes where they had no reason to believe Pedialyte-friendly individuals would live. And these were most notably around college campuses. And delivery services were saying, why suddenly do we have high demand for Pedialyte? What had emerged in that community was a completely new use for this product. If you had looked at any individual household unit in that community, you would have had no reason to predict Pedialyte use. But as a whole, the phenomena of Pedialyte as a hangover cure did emerge. And what Pedialyte later did was they completely rebuilt their market. They said, you know what, that's a fantastic opportunity for us. They would have missed it if that emerging phenomena had not been brought to light for them. Another example of how complexity plays out is in this rejection of averages. And I want to bring this up because when I do consulting, I'm very often asked, how do we reach millennials? right? So there's this idea that there is a unified group called Millennials, and we can talk to them and things are going to resonate if we understand the millennial mindset. What Pew Research tells us is that 60% of millennials don't self-identify as millennials. If you give them the descriptions of that group, they don't resonate with it at all. Okay, so to say, let's market to the average millennial is probably an enormous mistake. So what do we do instead? Well, we recognize that the market is a complex system. Yes, we can take averages. We can speak to average to some extent, but it doesn't get us very far. It can be a huge mistake to assume that every consumer is just a representation of the average in the population. Yes, we should use our data to target the proverbial segment as one, but we have no excuse not to be watching for larger trends. We could have a whole class about trend watching and futurists. There are people out there who are spending a lot of time watching for these emergent phenomena. Right now, there are so many interesting ones that are going on. One that I saw this week was actually, I don't know if you guys saw hotels.com. So Pew Research did this survey where they found that people are very anxious talking about politics right now, and that the election as a whole is a huge cause of uncertainty for people. So hotels.com started this promotion where you could literally rent space under a rock for $5 a night. That would be pretty unheard of in former times, but that overall zeitgeist gave them an opportunity to do something really creative. Okay. All right. The second idea I want to talk about that comes out of complexity theory is the idea of adaptation. Those of you who took, we all took high school biology and we learned about evolution and the survival of the fittest, often thought about this. We ended up thinking about this as the adaptation in a given species. In a complex system, we recognize that adaptation, the survival of the fittest, isn't just due to one entity. It isn't just due to how good your firm is or how strong your market segment is, but it's due to the entire system that you're part of. And this becomes kind of fun if we think about examples. We won't watch this because I think the technology may make it difficult. But you may remember Jerry Maguire. And at the opening of Jerry Maguire, he works for this big sports entertainment agency, right? And it's his job to represent athletes. And the argument that sort of the value proposition that such an agency would provide would be that we are going to help these athletes make the most money possible. At the beginning of the movie, Jerry has this epiphany where he says, wait, we've lost it. We've lost the entire thread. We should be doing something different. We should be helping people. We should be focusing on what that athlete really needs as a human. We should take fewer clients and make less money. And so he goes to Kinko's and he makes 1 million copies of this. He puts this in everybody's mailboxes. And the next morning, everybody claps for him and then he gets fired. Now, you could say Jerry's doing something great here. It resonates with him. It's his passion. It's his purpose. Those are all words we use in marketing. He also is doing something great for their key customer. That is their client. But he gets fired ultimately because he's not thinking about the entire system within a strategy has to live. An optimal strategy in marketing delivers this value to a certain set of consumers, but it also has to provide value to the company itself and to its collaborators. And that is the piece that we often miss. So the first thing I would say is being in a complex system means that with regard to this particular adaptation piece, that the strategies that survive are the ones that are serving everyone. Okay, so if you're considering a marketing strategy, think about how it serves not just your company, not just your customers, but also your collaborators. The other thing that we often do is we look at what other firms are doing and we try to learn from the strategies that they use. Similarly, sometimes it's easy to look at those strategies and get the idea that they are surviving only because they serve a given customer, right? Or only because they serve the firm itself. You can do some sort of forensics here that will tell you a little bit about what your competitors are probably doing. If we look at the case of Facebook, there is data that suggests that in fact it does do good things for its customers, right? So particularly as people transition life phases, they get to retain some social capital that's good for them. And it does seem to do some good things for its employees, and certainly the firm is making plenty of money. The question was, okay, given its astronomical growth, what strategy is it what about this strategy is really working, is making it survive when other social media platforms are failing? We know company, we know customer. The interesting part is collaborators. And this is a value that's a little bit more hidden, but if we keep the fact that this is working in a system in mind, we know to go look for that third source of value, and sure enough, you can find it. And I would argue that the strategies that survive are going to be hitting all three of these C's. If you don't see all three, look for the third one. That may be the magic. That may be the differentiator. Okay, so what does this mean? If we want to move past Mad Men, we want to develop strategies with a systematic consideration beyond just the consumers and the firm, also into the collaborators. All right, find out who's benefiting when you look at a strategy, and think about whether you can do the same thing if you want to adopt a similar strategy. Okay, third point from complexity theory I want to talk about in marketing is that everything evolves. You never sell to the same consumer twice. Your segments are not going to endure forever. Your individual consumers are also going to change. And this really pushes us to think multidimensionally. And we'll talk about this as I go through this point, but in general, what is our job? Our job is to manage the customer experience. Not only in terms of getting them to the sale, but also in terms of communicating with them all along the way. And this is kind of something that can start to feel fuzzy. What I will argue to you and what we teach in our classes is that there are systematic, rigorous ways to do this. And there are frameworks that we can use that move us past the old Mad Men model. And to be honest, that model is probably something you guys work with often, right? So the marketing and sales funnel is a time-honored tool, and it's not wrong in some ways, but let's talk about the dimensions here. It doesn't do much to tell us about whether we can go in and out of the funnel along the way, which you'll often hear somebody refers to a leaky funnel, which means people seem to disappear really fast, but we certainly don't talk about inroads into the funnel. So that's one interesting thing that happens with the funnel. Just straight longitudinal linear relationships are assumed. The other thing that happens if we stick with the funnel is that our primary focus is going to be on awareness, right? If you don't get enough people into the funnel, there isn't much you can do as you go farther through based on this very simple kind of two-dimensional presentation. It's appealing because the math on it is so lovely, but the truth of it as it plays out is that it doesn't accommodate any kind of complexity, that is change in the consumer over time or change in the market over time. So a model that we often work with that I found quite useful, in fact, is this McKinsey consumer decision model, which you may also have run across. What we do is we analyze what's happening at each major touch point in this model. We can then see if we're missing opportunities. What we know now is that consumers don't always go through these in a linear order at all, right? So we've added one dimension in that we now have a circle instead of a line, but we also have people that jump in at 3. We have people that jump in at 2. We have people that jump in at 1. We have people who are habitual purchases who just stay in a loyalty loop and never again change what they're doing. And that changes the way we understand their loyalty. We talk a lot about loyalty as well, and that there are different kinds. If you're only loyal because you're stuck in the loyalty loop through habit, that's really a spurious case of loyalty. But this is still so better. Okay, we've moved beyond the just point-to-point dimension into a circle. In the MBA classes, we move this a step farther and we add another dimension yet. And again, if you reflect on your own experience, you can understand how this happens. It's not simply that you move through a process. It's that you move deeper and deeper into your experience with a given product. In some cases, we want that to be fast, right? We want this to be pretty simple. This is on the left. When we're making a deliberate decision, we want to smooth this out for consumers as much as we possibly can and make this path to repurchase easier and easier. This creates an upward spiral, right? In the sense that they become more and more and more connected to your brand with each satisfying encounter. On the other hand, though, sometimes it's a very different thing, right? So we have people who just have a really strong trigger to purchase. Maybe they're just curious. And what they're going to have to learn is how to interact with the process or with the product, right? So they're going to have this experience that draws them upward. They can become increasingly involved, but you need to manage that all along the way with different kinds of tactics. So now we don't just have a circle, we have a spiral. right? And really that represents consumer experience in a lot of ways in a much truer sense than a funnel ever possibly could, right? And then we can overlay on this the way the consumer is processing, and this is where we get the magic. Okay, so if any of you have read Thinking Fast and Slow or have followed behavioral economics, you know that we have these general dual system models that say sometimes people are in this quick system 1 world, sometimes they're in this slower system 2 world, right? And what we know is that consumers move back and forth. So not only do we want to understand whether they're more likely to be in this sort of loyalty loop where we want everything to be easy, we also want to understand if there are times when they switch, right? And they're switching from loyalty to increasing involvement and back. When we bring these things together, I want to show you some examples of a project actually from the class this summer that was mentioned earlier. I had a group of students who worked on Apple Pay, the card, and they were trying to figure out, frankly, why the Apple Pay was not a card, while the Apple Pay system was not taking off. So they took this McKinsey decision journey model and they overlaid on it the systems in which they thought people were processing. So they said at the trigger point, it looks as though the consumers in system 1. So they're being exposed to the Apple Pay marketing collateral. They're moving through it. They're getting it off their phone. They're not processing it very deeply. And Apple's made that very easy for them to do. The problem there is that what you need at that beginning, again, is that trigger. You need curiosity. You don't want everything to be so seamless that nothing is noticed. They said that's an opportunity. Now, on the other hand, we move into active evaluation. Apple is still in system 1. They're still making things really easy and really fast to process, so it's just getting missed. Nobody's paying attention. What they're saying, though, is the consumer, when they're deciding how to pay for something, may actually be in system 2. They're really thinking, and they want information given to them that helps them make an actual decision. So the group said that's a second opportunity. So we need to disconnect the systems at the trigger. We need to align the systems in active evaluation. And by doing this, they were able to develop actual interventions that could be used. So for example, we're going to, at the moment that somebody is evaluating this as an option, tell them why it's a good option. Be system 2 at that moment, all right? And then they also did a survey. There were some interesting things that they learned about why people might care about making this decision one way or another. So they said, if we're gonna be system 2 at the moment of evaluation, let's activate these goals and tell people that the Apple Card can do this for them. Interestingly, just to toss this in, they also did some interesting work where they found out basically these cards are not well differentiated, these different means of payments. People don't really know the difference, which they also identified as a really interesting opportunity to speak to the consumers' different decision-making systems. So they found, for example, using some pretty easy, simple regression analysis, that helping even a little bit in terms of the perception of cashback rewards would make Apple much better positioned to convert its Gen Z target audience. Okay. And so then they went ahead and they pulled this through an entire strategic design. Okay, so what are they doing? They're working with the consumer experience in a truly multidimensional way. It's not just a funnel that you have to sort of handcuff them to stay in. It's an entire cycle where people move in and out of different processing systems. And it's our job to figure out how to match up or challenge the information processing that they're engaging in. Okay, and then next, I want to talk about a third idea from complexity theory, and that is that self-organization happens and it's a problem. I think that a lot of you, if you're interested in getting an MBA, you are aware of this. We can capture all the dimensions we want to. We can have all these frameworks to use and come up with great suggestions. And the problem is that we tend to rely on old existing structures anyway. And we spend a lot of time in consumer behavior talking about the dangers of relying on our self-organized cognitive structures, because they fall prey to a ton of biases. We tend to just confirm what we already know. What I see a lot when I work with firms is that the firm, again, is thinking a lot about why they're doing what they're doing, but they have really forgotten about whether the consumer cares or knows what that differentiator is. And it is remarkable how often this happens. And these are sophisticated firms. But the conversations in the boardrooms are very different than the conversations we need to have when we talk with our customers, all right? We often tend to fall prey to our own habits. When we're really close to something, we really can't see it. I used to work in the fragrance industry, and we had such interesting conversations because fragrance houses and brands that work with them have a very strong belief that all of these brands are very well differentiated, that Chanel is very different from Louis Vuitton, is very different from Vera Wang, is very different from L'Oreal, is very different from Lancome. That's to them, they're very different. But when we did this big survey of Middle America, the truth was those differences were lost on a lot of consumers. The only one that really looked different was Vera Wang because she had something to do with weddings, right? So what seems different to us, when it goes over into the system of marketing as a whole, can look very, very similar to the consumer, okay? So this is an example here of an ad that I'm sure made a lot of sense when it was put together. I work with my ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend. That made sense in a conversation where people thought really hard. To me, it's very hard to decipher. You put this in a magazine where people are in their proverbial quick system one, it is nothing but confusing. Other things that have fallen apart, likely because people just relied on their self-organized knowledge system. This is an interesting one from Delta. And you could say they were using great behavioral economics here because they took abstract information and made it very concrete. So union dues cost around $700 a year. What they were trying to do was to dissuade their employees from unionizing. A new video game system with the latest hit sound like fun, put your money towards that instead of paying dues to the union. Probably a bit overthought, right? Because the truth is, video games are kind of trivial. And a consumer, that is an employee in this case, who slows down and thinks about this at all, which they will because it's a big decision, they have motivation, opportunity, and ability to think about it, are likely to say, you know what, I can give $700 to my union and have better health care and be able to better take care of my children, or I can get a video game? Woo, right? That's actually a pretty bad comparison, all right? Interesting marketing that was done by Airbnb. Again, you can imagine the conversations that happened, right? In this really information-rich situation where people felt they really knew what was going on. So they put up these billboards pushing against taxes that were going to be levied on Airbnb. We hope you use some of the $12 million in hotel taxes to keep the library open later. Now, this is supposed to make people not support these taxes. Doesn't really work, right? It's a little too complicated, right? And then Dove famously they've done some great stuff, but they've also made some big mistakes, right? In a boardroom, this made sense. In a boardroom, among people who all had developed a certain kind of knowledge structure, this didn't create a problem. When it went out into the complex system that is in the market, where it was interpreted in the light of an entire sociological discussion, it was a problem. So what do we have to do? We have to do, if we're going to embrace this complex characteristic of the market, is recognize that we are better off being novices. That any given moment needs to be considered in light of the system in which that moment exists. Challenge your self-organized knowledge structures so that you see how it can apply in this dynamic system, right? And then the last point I want to make relates to this general idea about chaos theory. And recall that I said earlier that when you have a lot of unpredictability, you have a lot of information waiting for you. You just have to figure out how to get it out. But what we tend to do once we extract that information is we give it law-like status. And I want to talk about how we can flip that so that we're actually still trying to get more information out of the system. So another interesting tenet of complexity theory is that it's much easier to check that a solution is correct than it is to actually solve the problem in the first place. So we're really good at getting programs that can check whether something is right, but to actually get there is another matter. And this is important because we've built a lot of models based on retrospective data. So for example, the product life cycle model, which has been shown to roughly hold in like 30,000 different cases, is based on data, right? So we saw the way that a company worked. We saw this kind of trajectory. We created a model out of it, and then we showed that the model was generalizable. We spend a lot of time. This is basically the heart of Marketing 612. So we took chaos, we extracted information from the degree of change and the rate of change. All right, we have all the math to do this. And then we went back and qualitatively figured out what happened across all these different stages. So that's great. We've then put the math in this, as I said, that we can quantify this, we can use this model, and we can check whether that solution works across a wide variety of industries. That looks like the ending place. And what happens because we have something that's this deterministic is that we take it like it's a sentence, that it is a prescription, it is how things are going to work no matter what. But when this was actually gaining ascendance, HBR said, no, this is a dependent variable. This is something you get to shape. You are not a victim of this system. What you do as a marketer is you have to solve the problem, not just check that the solution was correct. All right, and as of right now, that's what we have over artificial intelligence. We can solve faster. AI is really good at checking the goodness of fit of a solution, but we can get there, all right? And interestingly, this is what you hear if you talk to people out on the front lines doing this. You have people like Mark Pritchard saying, I don't believe in the product life cycle, okay? No matter how much data suggests that it is a workable solution. So what do? Well, we can look to Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom. She was an economist, and she said, actually, if we're gonna be scientific about anything, in this case, let's fill in the blank marketing, it's about understanding where a theory or its models fit and when they don't. So what we try to talk about, and this is one of the great things about having executives in the class, is that you can highlight cases where you've seen deviation from these models. And those are, I mean, we learn extraordinary things because those deviations exist. And if you go to a university where people are doing research, there is nothing they want to talk about more than those, because those are truly interesting. Those are the insights that we get in our classrooms that then fire our research as we move on. And one interesting one that you may have heard of, this is an argument that's made by Nicholas Nassim Taleb in his book Anti-Fragile, and he says, in fact, there's some entire classes of products that don't have anything like a product life cycle. The longer they've been around, the longer they're gonna be around. That is to say, it's not as though their probability of starting to decline goes up over time. It in fact goes down, right? And those products are called lindy, right? So one of them that is really interesting that we've talked about as professors for a long time is the lecture. We've been lecturing students forever, right? So the belief was we've been lecturing students for 2,000 years. We're probably going to keep lecturing students. It's lindy. Now, here's an interesting thing. Has the world changed so much that even that is no longer lindy? It's an interesting question, right? But this is what we want, right? This is why teaching the full-time MBAs, many of them have experience, and particularly the executive MBAs is so much fun because you guys can move beyond the world of Mad Men. You can practice and think about marketing multidimensionally in terms of the market, the emerging trends that come out of it, the consumer themselves and their multidimensional journey. And as you see it reflected in and violating, in fact, these established models that we might otherwise look to over and over as an example of our self-organized knowledge. Because you have this information and because we can bring our frameworks to it, we can extract information from that. All right, so what I would ask you to think about is which of these points presents the biggest challenge to the way you or your firm currently thinks about marketing. Every single one of them could be the grounds for a very long discussion. I'd be happy to talk with you offline about this or answer questions about it if you'd like. Sort of reflecting on my experience in working in consulting, what I've often seen is that this idea that a given target segment has a certain amount of endurance over time and that we don't have to keep considering emergent phenomenon. It's a consistent issue that comes up. And it's sort of understandable because we invest so much in marketing research and then we want to keep using it for a long time. If we can figure out what changes and what stays the same, we have a lot of power. But we also don't lose the information that comes with changes that happen over time. So with that, I will close up. Happy to take some questions or discuss any of this further.
Hi, Kate. Thank you so much. We have plenty of questions, so I'm just
Okay,
going to
great.
start. Here's the first one. Participatory marketing, where marketers don't just present information to consumers but involve them in the process, is where smart brands are headed. Where does this fall in the spectrum of multidimensional marketing?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I think that, so for example, if we look at phenomena like consumer-generated innovation, I think what you're getting there is you are getting an additional piece of the market that's going to allow you to see emerging phenomena a bit more quickly. And I really like that about it. I think that because we are not coming in with a model that we impose on consumers, but allowing them to be part of the generation process, if we can monitor that, not just on a given individual level, but across the groups of participating consumers, you're going to be able to see emergent things a lot faster. And smart analysis of that is going to give you some very cool insights to work with. I think one thing we do have to be a little bit careful about is the fact that we are still sort of treating our consumers, we are interfering with the system in some ways, right? So each consumer has their own life system. And when we put ourselves into it, we don't leave it to simply devolve or evolve organically, right? So we do need to be careful about the potential biases that we introduce because we're reaching out to them and extracting information from them. And one thing that I am a bit concerned about is what I've referred to as the extractive economy. So you'll hear often in marketing right now that information is the new oil. And that sounds fantastic. It sounds empowering. It sounds like we're saying this is really valuable stuff. But if you look at economies where oil has been systematically extracted and not much has been left to give back to the system, you have ghost towns and a lot of wreckage and a lot of pathology. We need to be careful when we do this, that we are staying true to the idea of participation, and that we are making sure that we're not just sort of extracting stuff from consumers without attending to the system in which they live and making sure that it remains healthy.
Well, thank you so much. Here is another one. Any current thinking about the 22 immutable laws of marketing by Reeves and Trout? I've always wondered if those immutable laws have changed or been repeated.
Yeah, so I could not list those 22 immutable laws for you. What I can tell you is that I've been doing some research with a doctoral student on Cialdini's, some of the tenets in Cialdini's book, Influence, which is still widely recommended. And Dr. Cialdini is a brilliant and a very kind man. However, that book was written in 1984. In 1984, there was precisely 0% internet penetration in the United States. And what I will tell you is that those central laws of influence, we can't replicate those effects. For example, I can't get things like time-based scarcity online to work. Countdown timers don't seem to accelerate purchase. They may have other effects, but they don't seem to make people buy or willing to pay more. And we've collected over 35,000 data points on this. There is every reason to believe that what we consider laws change over time. And again, that's exactly the kind of stuff we want to talk about in the class. Because if we can have a conversation about how and why they've changed, we have some really interesting work to do together. There is very little, honestly, that is immutable right now. And I would hesitate to say that much of that is going to age very well.
Okay, here's another one. Companies like Nike, Patagonia took unique position in marketing that sounded political to some customers. Yep. From a marketing perspective, is it needed to respond to each cause, or should we stay away from political causes? How do we take a decision on this?
Yeah, it's a great question. What the research suggests is that you might damage yourself, right, if you pick a particular side. But you won't get a huge boost in some cases. It really depends on the norm in your industry. So for example, Under Armour stayed really silent during the Colin Kaepernick discussion. And that was not appreciated by their customers. So your target customer is gonna, they're gonna tell you how much that matters to them. So that silence was not great for them, in part because their product was so closely aligned with that particular message, right? And the particular person who was conveying the message. So I think if you have leaders associated with certain political parties with whom you are commonly associated in a functional manner, you better be ready to make a statement, because you're going to keep appearing alongside them, whether you mean to do it or not. Okay, so you're going to need to decide whether you endorse that or you don't. Otherwise, you're basically letting your marketing get away from you. I think that right now, but I'll also say one thing interestingly about Patagonia. So one of my project groups this summer was working on Patagonia. And what they found is that Patagonia's target consumer cared a little bit about Patagonia's brand purpose, but they actually just wanted a really good coat, right? At a good price. They actually did have a highly functional focus. Now, was it kind of a nice, warm, fuzzy thing that Patagonia cares about the environment? Yeah, sure, right? But it's not going to override problems in product quality. And what they found suggested that Patagonia was a bit overplaying its hand in terms of identity. They were prioritizing something that was a bit more than the consumer really needed in that category. So I think the answer is, if you are consistently affiliated with people who take a viewpoint, you need to decide where to be. Not doing so is going to be a liability. However, keep a finger on the pulse of your target market in terms of what matters to them. There are cases where people just want to get away from political statements too. I think that the statements that every brand needs to be highly political right now, they're a little overblown. People are tired of this to some extent. And so you need to be careful, choose your battles wisely. And what I'll also say is, if you're gonna do it, you have to be sincere about it. What's gonna burn you is taking these stands in ways that don't show that you're willing to incur a cost. What we know from evolutionary biology is that costly signals are the only ones that mean anything. The reason the peacock's feathers are meaningful is because it is an incredibly costly thing to produce that amount of color, right? And so, and sort of the display is a lot of energy. So if you're gonna do it, talk about first what you are willing to cost yourselves. It may be that you're willing to cost yourself some consumers, and if so, that's really important to know up front. If you're not willing to incur any cost, if you're saying, well, we're just going to make more money if we do this, you're going to come off as inauthentic, and it's going to fall like it's going to thud. It's not worth it. If you're going to do it, really mean that you're going to do it, and commit ahead of time to some costs, because they're likely to come.
Thank you so much, Cait. Here's another one. Can you name a company who you think is doing multidimensional marketing right?
Yeah, so this is interesting. I think that a lot of it is, I think you see some of this among some of the newer companies, obviously, because they're coming into a world that is structured like this. They're likely to be companies that have access to a lot of consumer behavior data. So I had a very interesting conversation with Robinhood last week. And they're in real time observing the way that their consumers are interacting with the product that they've created. They're also very aware of how the market as a whole that they're working in is responding to them, right? They understand that, you know, the more established traditional investment banks are going to take some kind of position relative to them, and they need to anticipate that. They're also thinking about who the best collaborators might be, like who do you align with? How do you get people to engage with this in a way that is part of, in a sense, their developmental process? So we were talking about, is there some way for them to work with, say, universities to use this as a way for people to understand and demystify their experience in the markets without creating risk, because they're also very aware of that. I think they do also know, when we talk about that spiral, they do know that a lot is driven first by curiosity. And then the next questions are, okay, so how do we get people to make this a meaningful part of their financial wellness, not just sort of this cute little app that lives on their phone? So from my conversations with them, I think that they are thinking in a lot of these dimensions. And I think that bodes very well for them. You know, so far, you know, they're gonna hit snags, of course, like any company, but what I'm seeing them do, I think, has been very smart in that respect.
Cait, here is another one. For a technology consulting company that has different Fortune 500 airlines, banks as clients. How does it separate corporate marketing to client account-specific marketing? Is that possible in B2B marketing at all?
Oh, so you're basically asking, I might need a little clarification on this question. So you're basically asking if this stuff applies to B2B marketing?
Correct.
Yeah, so I would say yes. So often what we use for consumers is psychographics, right? And what we use for firms are firmographics. So what you're looking for in a given segment is now, all the firms that have similar underlying goals and priorities and needs. So a lot of the basic stuff about thinking through the way that a firm is going to change over time is going to be similar. You look at your target segments and you figure out how they come into the journey. Now, where the differences come in very often is in the fact that their processes are somewhat institutionalized, right? So if you're working with an RFP kind of process or something like that, you may have fewer degrees of freedom to play with. If you say, for example, we really want to get in later in the journey, even if we get filtered out at the beginning, you may not be able to do that as much. But I think that you can still think about designing a journey for a firm that is your client that combines different, I don't think we do this enough actually, that combines both system 1 and system 2, right? Because you have buyers, you have touch points within a firm who are under enormous time pressure, who need things to be really quick and easy. And that's what we usually expect, but at the same time, you need to keep yourself differentiated in their mind so that after the third time they go back out to get this rebid, they're not like, you guys are old hat. So you need to build in those sort of system 2 speed bumps for them at different times in your journey with them. And I don't think we think about that enough in B2B, but they're not just a funnel either. Right? They are going to have a long trajectory with you. And honestly, I would, what you want to be for that firm is Lindy. You don't want to be riding some kind of wave. You want your past history to be predictive of your future success with them. So I think a lot of this is very applicable. Now, with the airlines in particular, if you want to anticipate where their journey is going to go, there's a lot you've got to monitor, right? And I think that's where that set of clients as an emergent system is quite unique. Those firms are going to be trying to find solutions to a huge problem for the next 12, 18 months. To be honest, I think they've not done a bad job so far. I think the airlines have convinced people that they have quite a lot of precautionary stuff in place, but I would watch not just your clients, but the whole system of clients and see what's emerging across that group as a trend that you could speak to when you reach out to any given client.
Wonderful, thanks, Cait. Here's the next one. Can you elaborate a bit more on collaborative value?
Yeah. So collaborator value is, so we just did in my class yesterday, we did a live case with DuPont, big company. And DuPont had this interesting situation where they've always made Tyvek, which was always used in PPE, although nobody knew what PPE was before like December of this year in the market. And then they got a call from the federal government, from the White House, in about February of this year. And the White House said, we need more PPE in the right places, and we need it now. Now, the DuPont itself, has enormous expertise in this material, but suddenly they needed to find collaborators who could turn it into garments. They needed to get it to those collaborators fast, and usually that was a 4 to 5 month lead time. They needed to get it to them. They needed to get the garments made. They needed to get the garments delivered back to the hotspots in the United States where they were really needed. So what you have there is a question about whether a huge firm like DuPont decides that they're going to do this themselves, right? And say, okay, that's fine. We'll pop up some new manufacturing facilities. We will take on delivery, or whether they find collaborators. And what they needed to do to make a collaboration succeed was find collaborators for whom it was a win-win. So an example of one collaboration they undertook was, in fact, with Under Armour. Okay, so Under Armour had some unused manufacturing capacity in the Far East, and Under Armour needed to do something to repair its brand perception because it had made a misstep in some of the social movements in the prior year. By partnering together, DuPont had a huge benefit because they could use that unused capacity. Under Armour had a way to rehabilitate its, hey, we're in this together kind of brand position. okay, and to use some unused capacity that wasn't, nobody's buying right now fancy, well, at the time, nobody was buying fancy exercise clothing because organized sports were kind of shut down at the time. So what you had was this really mutually beneficial collaboration. In general, we think about collaborative value, we think about value design collaboration, value delivery collaboration, and value communication collaboration. You want everybody in that system to be checking as many of those boxes as you can. And again, you can sort of analyze potential collaborations in that way and figure out what's going to resonate, what's really going to work in the long term. Bad collaborations will work for a minute. Good example of that is KFC collaborated with a Japanese streetwear designer. It was totally useless, right? For a lot of reasons we could go into at length. It didn't provide better design of value for anyone. It didn't communicate particularly effectively about either brand. And there was no sort of delivery logistics gain to it, right? On the other hand, when KFC collaborated with Crocs, you saw a huge boom, right? And the fit between those brands was far better. So they both got sort of more value out of it. And they were both able to design something that was really resonant with their brand. So, and then Crocs, of course, found themselves in KFC stores, which provided a delivery component for them that they didn't otherwise have. So that's how we would usually think through those. But I'd be happy to talk more about that offline if you're interested.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I believe we have time for 2 more questions, and then we can wrap up. First of all, here's a big thank you from one of the attendees. This is fascinating. Thank you for the presentation. To your point regarding market research, inherent to this notion of complexity seems to be change. Have you seen or done any research regarding the pace of change? For example, how do you know when to reassess your assumptions to account for change, or how do you recognize that change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would love there to be a number on that. I think that's a difficult question. I'm trying to think right now, have I seen much? It's so industry specific, right? So some industries have strong seasonality components. You're probably going to collect data every season. What I have found most interesting is to think about disruptive moments. So, you would probably need to figure out what these are in your industry. So in general, consumers, and firms, they like what's already known, right? Even though it doesn't have much information, it's predictable. So we're willing to trade off novelty for predictability. But then there are these moments when the context changes and it disrupts that loop, right? And so, for example, this may be if we don't have a world in which, we have some new fresh thing delivered to us every day that is, incredibly confusing. But say we take an individual consumer's life, I think that you have these disruptible moments when they have major life changes. So you have a marriage or you have a divorce, or you have a home move, or you have going to college, or you have a job change. Okay, so what I would say is you need to reassess when a large chunk of your consumers is experiencing some kind of disruptible moment like that, when the cues that used to reinforce consumption are gone, right? Or when the routines that used to be triggered are no longer available. So what I would do is figure out analytically, if you can, what reinforces the behavior, the purchase that you care about, and be very sensitive to when those elements change in the market. So for example, if I used to walk to the office every day, I would stop for Starbucks. All of a sudden, nobody's walking to the office. So any firm that is contingent on a walk by foot traffic needs to reevaluate what its target is doing. There just isn't a cue there that reinforces the purchase. So I would hesitate to put a number on it, but I think you could identify specific cues, or system of cues that are critical to consumption of your product, and watch for changes there. And that's when you need to reassess.
Excellent, thanks. And the last one for today. For small businesses working with small budget and monitoring tools, what tools exist for the company that is trying to move from the RFP process, as you mentioned, into a program of record or go to vendor for B2B or government contracts?
Yeah, so I honestly haven't done much in government contracts for a while. What I would say is that it's going to be very industry specific. I wish I knew more about that, to be honest. I think that if you have a small budget, there's lots of free information out there about things like changes in trends, and monitoring of what's going on in different industries. So those are useful. Exactly the mechanics of shifting your customers from an RFP-based system to another, I think that's probably something you would honestly just need to find out from them, how shiftable that is. So much of this is entwined in a whole other complex system of regulation that it may be tough to do from the outside. But I think if we had a specific case, I'd be happy to talk with you more about that in another context.
Perfect. Well, Cait, I would like to thank you so much for your time and for sharing these valuable insights with our audience. And I would also like to thank all of you for attending the first Wharton webinar in series of 3. We will be promoting the next presentation with Professor Jennifer Bluin, scheduled for January 19th in the weeks to come. And I really wish you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks again.
Thanks all.